I have friends, some of whom I greatly respect, who say we mustn't take everything Trump says at face value. He just likes to shock everybody in order to drive both friends and foes towards the conference table. It's all going to turn out in the world. Okay, in the end, this is not another Munich. Well, I'm at the pessimistic end of the scale because I think we have to assume that Trump means what he says. He's been talking and acting, frankly, like an ignorant brute. And I use those words advisedly in the past week or two, because those of us who've been following the Ukraine war since its inception once felt so deeply for what these people have suffered that there they were attempting to live a life in which, yes, they did want to embrace the West. They did want to embrace NATO. They did want to be part of the EU. And the fundamental reason that Putin launched his invasion, he was not prepared to tolerate a successful, free, democratic Ukraine next door. Now, what scared us all so much about Trump, we got used to the idea of Putin, this monstrous, murderous figure next door. It's the idea of this new America that is scaring the hell out of us, because we're faced with an American president who seems to want to embrace Putin and who seems to regard Zelensky as the bad guy in all this. So this is pretty scary, because we've all taken for granted for many, many years that the United States was the cornerstone of Western defense. And the idea that this is now out of the window. But I think we've got to divide this whole story into two halves. The first thing that we cannot say too often is that there's one big thing that Donald Trump is absolutely right about, that for years, Europe has relied on the Americans to pay the bills and do most of the heavy lifting for European defense. And it is a disgrace. It ought to be a badge of shame that even we, the British, have been party to this. And this is the big thing Trump is right about, that we have failed for years to step up to the plate. Trump has warned us and warned us that he was going to put the screws on, and now he has, and it's the one thing he's dead right about. But of course, the thing he's dead wrong about in our eyes, and we have to keep saying this, his language about Ukraine is contemptible. That to describe Ukraine as the aggressor in all this is a shameful from the President of the United States. If we contrast it, as I've done at the Times this morning, with the rhetoric of John F. Kennedy in Berlin back in 1963, Ich bin ein Berliner. He identified with these beleaguered people. He brought an audience of hundreds of thousands of Berliners screaming to their feet. He inspired the free world. And now we've got Trump appearing to be prepared to cut, not only to cut Europe loose and to cut Ukraine loose. So I think, on the one hand, we've got to keep our cool. We mustn't succumb to despair. But on the other hand, we've got to take what's happening very, very seriously.
Yeah, thanks, Max. And President Kennedy didn't realise he was referring to himself as a donut, I believe, in that wonderful speech back in his... But that's another issue.
No, but everybody knew what he meant.
Everybody knew what he meant. Katie, we've talked about this before, that there does seem to be a gap between what Trump says and what Trump does and what Trump believes. Do you believe, or rather, do you think he believes that Zelensky started the war and that it is Ukraine that is the aggressor and that Europe's been a fait accompli in this? Or is it simply, as Max has hinted at, that it's a way of getting people around the conference table and so on?
I think in truth it's hard to know. Ultimately, there is lots of that, in that space of disinformation and, various theories that go round. There are people who take the view, oh, this isn't a democracy in Ukraine because there hasn't been an election and so forth. And you can see in some circles of, MAGA and the Republican Party, there are people who take those views. But then you speak to those figures who are trying, I think, to be optimistic about what Donald Trump is saying. And they hope that this is this approach of going in really hard and saying something and then working back from there, and also potentially making Putin feel as though he has Donald Trump's support, and then Donald Trump can extract something back. But in truth, I just don't think we're going to know until you get a few weeks into how this is really shaking out. And I think what's interesting in some of the reporting in the Times today is this, sense from figures, close to those in the White House, saying that, they are struggling to even keep up with what Donald Trump is doing and saying on this issue. And therefore, it does add to the sense that perhaps this isn't a game of 5D chess and a perfectly choreographed strategy. There is a bit of winging it on all sides.
Yeah, I think you've got an interesting job ahead of you there, Katie. If I'm honest, Max, the one area where Trump was absolutely right, wasn't he? Was when he said that. Well, sorry, Sir Keir Starmer, you didn't stop the war in Ukraine, and there is a feeling abroad, isn't there, that what we did was simply prolong a war rather than bring it to a conclusion, and therefore occasion more people to be killed.
You're absolutely right that I've been also quite shocked in the last month or two by, a great friend of mine for whom I have enormous respect, a columnist whom actually, Simon Jenkins. And Simon said to me
yes.
When we were having lunch a month or so ago, he said there's one good thing that Trump's going to do. He's going to get us out of Ukraine. And I sat up and I said, what do you mean? He's going to sell out Ukraine to Putin. And Simon said, well, what do you want out of all this? He said, do you just want another generation of young Ukrainians killed? He said, in the end, this is going to end up in some sort of deal. And Simon also said, he's a little bit older than me, but not much. He said, as I get older, he said, I'm really becoming a pacifist. And he said, Trump is against wars. And he said, I'm with him on that. Now, I don't actually go with Simon about this, but I think it's terribly important to recognize there are a lot of people out there who are saying these things. And there is a feeling, there is a mood, well, is anything worth a war? Well, I'm one of those in that sense. I'm old-fashioned. I believe that it's a mark of a mature, grown-up democracy that we realize that sometimes it's essential to stand up for things and to fight for them. And I think this is one of these cases. And if we stand by, are we going to go back to the old world, and it's a very old world, of accepting spheres of influence? Is a deal going to be made which acknowledges that Putin, because he wants it, has a right to build a new Russian empire in which Belarus, Georgia, Ukraine, and those states around the periphery become vassal states of Russia? Now, one gets the impression from Trump's rhetoric that he is willing to go along with all this. Well, if he does, I'm afraid I can't buy that. But I think we also have to recognize there are quite a lot of people out there, some of them in European chancelleries, who are prepared to go along with this. And another thing we have to face. Britain should rearm, must rearm. But on the other hand, what we can do alone is very limited. Everything hinges on being in there with Europe. Now, I've always been a passionate anti-Brexiter, and I always thought that part of the price of Brexit would be we lose all influence in Europe, and so it's rather turned out. But we can't do much about defence or about helping Ukraine alone. We've got to work with the Europeans. And are they willing to do that? Now, again, I'm afraid I have to try and be realistic. The mood music coming out of Europe at the moment is that European leaders are, whatever their rhetoric about Europe, they're very wary about actually doing anything.
Well, let's move on to that, because both Sir Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron will be flying out to Washington to meet the Donald next week. No Germans invited, of course, because they're having one of their elections. And while there are ticklish issues to be resolved on possible tariffs on European and British exports to Magaland, top of the agenda will surely be Ukraine and Mr. Trump's remarkable appeasement of Vladimir Putin, a performance over the last few days which begs the question, just how did this apparent civility suggest you are speaking from a position of strength, Mr. President? Katie, Sir Keir Starmer has been playing Trump and the problems occasioned by Trump and the rift with Europe rather cannily, hasn't he?
Yeah, I think you can say that. There's obviously been so much written perhaps by all figures on this panel, about the potential problems there are going to be between Labour and the White House. And you can see some of that. We've seen the friction. We've seen what Elon Musk has said about Keir Starmer and so forth. But I think you can also look at, the fact no tariffs as of yet. You can look at some of the things Donald Trump has said about Keir Starmer since entering the White House. Actually saying, we don't agree on much on politics, but he seems like a decent guy. His wife, she's his secret weapon. It feels very warm. And he has got that visit to the White House. Obviously, Emmanuel Macron has slightly pipped him to it by going a day or two before, which I'm sure will make the French president very happy. But there are those channels of communication. I think the question now is, what can Keir Starmer do with it when he has this trip? Because we saw from Theresa May how a visit to see Donald Trump can go wrong. The hand-holding. We've seen the various press conferences with Donald Trump and other leaders where they start to be actually quite an embarrassing, face-saving exercise for the other leader, really, as they have to try and deal with what Donald Trump says and not, throw themselves into a diplomatic incident.
Yeah.
And therefore, can Keir Starmer really influence Donald Trump on Ukraine? And if he can't, can he get through it without, I think, having his reputation worsened by the meeting?
Well, it's interesting, Max, isn't it?
Can I make one point that I think is very important? And that is, I personally think we're in for a very, very difficult 4 years dealing with the Trump presidency. But there's sort of two strands I think need to be kept in mind. One is, although Donald Trump has been elected by Americans, he is not America. So we must never think we can give up on America, turn our backs on America. We have to keep hoping for a future in which we can build a new relationship with the United States. The United States is still the greatest power on earth. And although it's very hard to keep reminding ourselves of this when we have a president behaving like this, we've got to keep saying ourselves, we've got to keep reciting this mantra that there is an American genius out there. We have to keep talking to Americans, even if it's very difficult to keep talking to America's president. And secondly, that our governments, both Britons and Europeans, have no choice but to turn the other cheek in the face of Trump's repeated insults. And they are insults. They've got to keep talking to him. They've got to keep pretending that he's a rational person, whereas actually there's no evidence at all that he is a rational person. But the rest of us do not have that obligation. And I think the rest of us, we mere citizens, have to keep singing from the rooftops, we must keep giving this guy the lie that when J.D. Vance delivers his barrage of insults, that Vance is behaving like a thug, a gangster. And we, as citizens, we have the privilege of being able to say Vance is behaving despicably. And when Trump talks despicably, we as citizens can say that. But our governments, of course, have got the very thankless task of trying to treat Donald Trump as if he were a rational human being.